Welcome to Chapter 7, Lesson 3. We are going to be taking a look here at the way in which World War I was fought and the way in which World War I comes to a close. Specifically, we'll be looking at that last essential question of why do nations go to war? And essentially, right, you got to understand that nations go to war because they believe they can win. And in the case of all of these different countries that were fighting in World War I, whether you are in brown, the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, or whether you are the Allied powers in that kind of light green of France or Italy, Russia, and Great Britain, what you need to realize is that all of these countries had a belief that their side was capable of winning. Remember, we looked at that military spending from the beginning of World War I when we were in arms races, and in each of these countries felt like they had a shot at winning. They actually believed that this was going to be an incredibly swift victory for their country as they were beginning. But war had changed. Not in the very beginning, of course, but war definitely did change. For example, in the first 2 weeks, Germany had incredible success. They invaded through Belgium. That's what led Britain to join the war against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and help out France and Russia. And they had closed to within quite some distance of France, actually, of Paris, France, not too far away. But then something happened, and that something was that the French and the British realized that there was something new about this war, that artillery, machine guns were killing people at a pace never before seen. And I'm not talking about, just here or there. I'm talking about a tremendous upsurge in the way in which people are killed, the volume, the speed at which people are wounded and injured. And not into the scale of like just a couple hundred here. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. So before long, within the space of weeks, as death tolls became catastrophic, these armies looked for ways to protect themselves against these new and better weapons which could fire faster, longer, and from further away. The example here that we're looking at would be trenches. As artillery fire becomes the most prominent and vicious way of killing those people killing your enemy in World War I, each side begins to use trenches lined with barbed wire, mines, machine guns, to protect themselves, not just from the enemy soldier, but from enemy artillery fire. We'll do an example of this in class to help you understand why this is important. But when you stay rooted in one spot for years, and that's what we're talking about here, in some cases you were in the same trench for years, you're going to see incredible changes to the way wars are fought, whether it's going to be disease or whether it's going to be casualties versus deaths. A casualty is a wounding. It's not an actual death. It's going to be an incredibly difficult and bitter war thanks to the way in which it's fought, because every time somebody comes up with a way of stopping this mass killing, the opponent is going to come up with yet a more efficient way of killing someone. And let me show you what we mean by that. So I know I had said that we're looking here at new ways of fighting wars. So what we had just mentioned previously was this idea of trenches, that in order to combat artillery fire, which had killed more than anyone else in World War I, any other weapon in World War I, trenches were kind of the solution to that problem. So what happens? New forms of warfare are introduced to combat the trench. Now you can see here the trench right here. You can see soldiers in the trenches. Here's a soldier in a trench. Well, we look for ways to do that. Now, if I can't charge a trench and get right into it, I have to find a way to get to those enemies. Why not poison gas? I'll lob some shells up over the trenches. I know I can't hit them in the trench necessarily. I'll explode that poison gas and it'll seep into me, and it will kill people within those trenches. You can see here a man who was exposed to poison gas. You can see the burns on his face, the burns on his wrists and his hands where he wasn't covered. Well, how do you combat poison gas, right? We have to find new ways to do that. Well, let's come up with a new invention. Let's try gas masks. You're going to see tomorrow gas masks for dogs, gas masks for horses, gas masks for people, as an attempt to technologically combat gas. Okay, so gas doesn't work. All right, so artillery's not killing as much as it used to. Let's find out another way to do this. Let's try, I don't know, aerial combat. At first used for reconnaissance, later used for bombing. Bomb the trenches from above, much more accurate perhaps than you could get with poison gas. Well, that's not enough planes. It's an incredibly short life expectancy of only 2 weeks if you're a pilot, so we have to come up with another way of handling this kind of trench warfare. Why not the armored tank, where we can cross no man's land and go over the mines and not get shot with the machine guns and crush the barbed wire and the kinds of fighting here. You kind of see what I'm saying? It's almost like a anything you can do, I can do better, where you say, all right, artillery is killing you like never before, let's dig some trenches. All right, I'll keep dropping artillery on you, but I'm also going to drop poison gas on you. Yeah? Well, I got my gas mask. All right, well then have some of these aerial bombardments and aerial dogfighting. Oh, death toll is too high? Let's get some armored tanks here. Every time someone comes up with something, there's a way to counter that. An example here in America, of course, would be that we have ships traveling the ocean now, surface vessels traveling the ocean, and we're delivering our troops to World War I Europe. And what's happening? First time ever, we see large-scale submarine warfare. Right? Americans are arriving with a ton of troops from America into Europe. Submarine warfare is going to sink those. Well, America's going to say, I'm going to implement a convoy system so that we can attack those submarines, protect our ships, get our men there safely to fight. Not a single ship was lost on the way to Europe in terms of troop ships, thanks to that convoy system. But I think you get that idea of everything you can do, I can do better when it comes to war, leading this essential question of nations believing they can win right there kind of in the upper right-hand corner to turn out not to be true. In fact, the death tolls are unbelievable. At the bottom here, you see Men in Action, United States. This is 1968. This is the deadliest year in Vietnam in America. 213,000 casualties in 1968. That's 40%. So 4 out of every 10 people in 1968 that were involved in American combat operations were wounded. In World War I, 42 million, almost 43 million Allied troops were involved. Central Powers, 25 million, almost 25.5 million troops involved. Look at the sheer number of casualties. In some cases, in the tens of millions. And yet, half of that population was lost. Americans hated Vietnam for the incredible number of casualties. That was 1 year. This is in 4 years. The amount of death that we're talking about here is catastrophic, and the impact that it's going to have on the nations that are fighting this war is also catastrophic. You don't suffer 12 million or 10 million casualties, or 22 million casualties or 16 million casualties without having an impact on your willingness to fight the war. I mean, remember what we had talked about earlier in this chapter. We had said, I believe it was just yesterday's lesson, where you had to have a willing public to fight this war. It was why we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, you start throwing a combined, 35 million casualties or whatever it is, a ridiculous number of dead and wounded, into this small continent of Europe. I mean, because really that's what we're talking about. We're talking about in this one region, a very small region, we're talking about the deaths and casualties of woundings of some 35 million people. That's unbelievable. Especially in only 4 years. And that willing public that nations had to fight these wars, that willing public is going to go away. So while nations definitely thought they could have victory, remember, as what we said yesterday, you're only going to get that if you have a willing public. And by 1917, 1918, a lot of these nations didn't. And the proof is in the pudding, because in all of those central powers, whether it's going to be the Russian, whether it's going to be the Austrian, Hungarian Empire, or the German Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, you're going to see revolutions break out. In each of these countries, revolutions emerge. And they're not the only places either that have revolutions. The Russian Empire goes through its own revolution as well. All of these empires that were fighting this war experienced dramatic revolution. The Kaiser, the emperor in Germany, is overthrown. The emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is overthrown. The caliph of the Ottoman Empire is overthrown. The Tsar, or the leader of the Russian Empire, is overthrown. And all of these empires are going to find themselves collapsing. Let me show you what I mean. I'll give you a case example here. The case example we're going to use is going to be Russia. Because you can see here this bullet that says Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, overthrew the Russian government and established a new communist government. So we want to see what that looks like and how does that work. Communist governments being dictatorships where the government controls everything. So just really kind of quick to show you this case example, this kind of case study of what happens when you lose a willing public. Here is Russia before World War I. And really, this is actually an unfair representation of Russia because there's actually more political parties than just these two. So you have the Russian Empire. It's led by an emperor. It's called the Tsar. That's the emperor. That's kind of like the Caesar in the Roman Empire or the Kaiser in the German Empire. But Russia had a lot of political parties, and that was normal of most of these empires. A lot of them had many different political parties. That's not particularly unusual. So you have, for example, the Octoberists, which is a political party. You have the Bolsheviks that are a political party. And each of these groups want different things. Like, for example, the Octoberists wanted democracy, and the Bolsheviks wanted communism. Remember, communism is a type of dictatorship where the government will control everything. And so as the willing public in World War I begins to lose its willingness to fight in World War I, revolution will break out, and fighting actually begins between different groups of people. So you actually see, for example, in the case of Russia, you're going to see the Bolsheviks fighting the Tsar's forces, and the Octoberists fighting the Tsar's forces, and even the Bolshevists and the Octoberists fighting each other. Everyone is clamoring for a piece of the power. And when peace is finally settled, and it takes quite some time, when peace is finally settled, what you end up with is a new country. The Russian Empire is gone. And in its place is the Bolshevik Party. Just one Bolshevik Party or Communist Party which controls everything. They control the economy. They determine what your freedoms are or aren't. In this case, there are no freedoms. They control everything in this dictatorship. And here's the trick. Everyone is to be treated equally. It doesn't matter if you're a prince or a princess or the poorest worker in the poorest town in all of the Soviet Union, what used to be the Russian Empire, you will be treated equally. So this is just one example of what happens in one country as these revolutions strike these World War I powers, pushing and fighting to try and change the system that dragged them into this death machine of World War I. By November 11th of 1918, these nations are exhausted. Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, which is pulled out of the war, the Ottoman Empire. These nations are exhausted and they sign an armistice. Please note this is a truce. An armistice is a truce. It's not a peace treaty. That has to be negotiated after the fact. So we've got this temporary lull in fighting, and everyone's going to go to Paris, France. And in Paris, France, they're going to begin negotiating a treaty. And that treaty is called, eventually, the Treaty of Versailles. And everyone comes to the table with different ideas. Like, so for example, President Wilson says, you know what, I want to take a look at all these different reasons that nations went to war. I mean, we could rattle them all off, right? We saw ideas in the unification of Germany. We saw arms races. We saw self-determination. We saw crises like the issues with submarines and the sinking of the Lusitania or the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. We saw laws passed to keep people willing. And President Wilson in 1918 is going to go to Versailles and he's going to say, we have to do something about that. We have to put in place a plan that's going to delete those different reasons for war. And President Wilson's going to cause his plan the 14 points. He says, let's get rid of arms races. Let's get rid of fighting over the seas like with submarines. Let's get rid of self-determination. Let's give everyone their own place. if we do this, then we'll have no more future war. But the other nations of Europe aren't interested in that because that's too fair. That doesn't punish anybody, right? Because what you have here are nations that are crumbling. The German Empire crumbled. Austro-Hungarian Empire is crumbling. Ottoman Empire crumbling. Russian Empire crumbling. France, Great Britain, millions upon millions of dead and wounded soldiers. Who gets punished for this terrible catastrophe? Someone must be punished. Who will pay? And so they reject President Wilson's 14 points. They reject the idea of putting an end to the causes of war. And instead they look to blame someone. And in the case of World War I, they force Germany to admit its guilt. And they say, Germany, you did this. You're responsible. You killed more than any other. You must pay. Figuratively and literally. They forced Germany to pay billions and billions, $55 billion of reparations in 1918. That's trillions of dollars in today's money. Germany, if you remember, didn't even declare war first. That was Austria-Hungary. Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary. But you want to punish the person who killed the most? You want to make them pay? Then you make the Germans pay. And so what we end up seeing here then as World War I comes to a close is this Treaty of Versailles, which fails to deal with any of the causes of war. And it fails to treat nations equally as they exit this war, many of them in turmoil. And instead, it forces Germany to admit guilt to a war it didn't necessarily cause, and it forces Germany to pay a tremendous amount of reparations as damages, money to be paid to the winners as damages over the next 20, 30, 40 years. This is going to leave a terribly bitter, bitter taste, an angry taste in Germany's mouth. An angry taste that someone named Adolf Hitler will capitalize on in the 1920s and 1930s. The last point here is that the world changes as a result of World War I. What had been formerly empires of World War I are gone. And you can see here what I mean. Germany has lost a good chunk of land. You can see any area that I'll color in red has been lost to Germany. Poof, gone. You can see that the Russian Empire has lost a tremendous amount of land. It loses land that's called here as Romania. It loses all of this land of Poland. It loses Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. You can see that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is carved up into countries like Austria and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the rest of Romania and Yugoslavia. All of these countries are carved up. All of these countries are created out of the fallen empires of the world. Even Turkey is a new country which emerges from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And an attempt to welcome and to help all of these new nations handle the pressures of international relations and the existence of their countries, in many cases for the first time in centuries, a new League of Nations is created. A group of nations that together are supposed to stop this kind of tragedy from happening again. But the Senate in America is going to look at this and say, that doesn't work. You didn't deal with any of the root causes of war. You might have created a group to try and prevent a war, but you didn't deal with any of the root causes when you could have. And you create all these new countries. You force Germany to pay. You cripple it. This isn't going to end well. So America refuses to sign the Treaty of Versailles, hoping to keep itself free of foreign entanglements. And we'll see how that plays out in upcoming chapters as we approach the 1920s and the 1930s and even World War II.